Wednesdays. This is a special series produced by the Society for Integrative Oncology. My name is Lee Leibel, and I'm delighted to be your host today. I am an active member of the Society for Integrative Oncology, SIO, and I work with cancer patients at all stages of care at New York Presbyterian Columbia University Medical Center in New York City. So today is our 14th episode, and this is our grand finale for the Wellness Wednesdays. And we have saved the best for last. I am delighted that Dr. Lorenzo Cohen from MD Anderson Cancer Center is our special guest today. And he is going to take us on a journey down the road less traveled, where we take a look at biofield therapies and their effect in oncology. So Dr. Cohen doesn't need introduction, but I'll just say a few words. He is a leader in the field of integrative oncology. He is a distinguished professor of clinical cancer prevention and director of integrative medicine program at MD Anderson Cancer Center, which is the University of Texas in Houston. He is also a distinguished clinical professor at Fudan University Cancer Center in Shanghai, China. And just a fun note for all of us, he's one of the founding members of the Society for Integrative Oncology and was one of our past presidents. So I want to also plug his book, which is one of my favorite books. It is The Anti-Cancer Living, The Mix of Six. And I recommend this book to all of my cancer patients, and it's on my bedside table at my own house. Wonderful for anyone interested in prevention of cancer and non-communicable diseases, as well as anyone who's going through a cancer journey, an individual and their families. So please join me in a warm welcome. Dr. Cohen, I'm going to hand it over to you for your presentation. At the end, I'll come back on and moderate questions. So it's all yours.
Thank you, and thrilled to be able to join you all today and find out that I'm the anchor for this wonderful series that Lee and the SIO has put on. I think there's, of course, we can focus on all the negative that's going on in our world at the moment, but there is, of course, a lot of positives, and being able to connect like this on a more regular basis is one of them. And I think that there's everyone, I'm sure, has had this experience of, you know, even though we are physically isolated from each other, there's in some sense, we're more socially connected than ever before, thanks to some of the wonderful technology and all the efforts of people of trying to get us more connected than we have been actually in the past when we could physically be together, which is fascinating. And some of the data, I'm not going to get into you know, issues around the pandemic. I'll take us down a totally different road today. But interesting that there is this higher sense of distress. An interesting paper published in JAMA back in June. But when they looked at this large cohort where they collected from hundreds of thousands of people back in 2018, and then they did it again in April, and found that there was no change in loneliness scores, so social isolation scores. So we've been doing well to be connected, and it's great to see you all here today. So thank you, Lee, for the plug for the book, Anti-Cancer Living. Those of you who know me know that I'm passionately focused in the area of diet and lifestyle, and I try and walk the walk, even walk the talk, even more so now that I've had my own personal experience with cancer that I'll describe to you a little further on in the talk, and some of the history behind that. You know, in thinking about the talk for today, you know, should I, you know, talk about diet and exercise? Well, everyone knows the data, you know, mind body, I looked at the past speakers, and there's been a lot on yoga and meditation, and that's really my forte and expertise. But there's an area that we've been researching now at MD Anderson for probably more than a decade that I tend to not talk to too many people about, certainly not the media. And I think some people on the call today may be surprised that we're even doing this research, but we are. And so I'll take you down what I call this road less traveled, certainly by most of our colleagues within the field of integrative medicine and what we call biofield therapies. So what is the biofield? Well, it's a field of energy and, in fact, information that's thought to regulate many hemodynamic functions of living organisms. And we know of a lot of these that are quite measurable, things like EEG, ECG, and others. We are bioelectric beings. And in fact, most of, although we tend to focus a lot on chemical interactions, most of the functions of our body run on electrical connections, starting of course with the electrical conduction of the heart, but most of the communication in the brain is electrical. Arguably it's around 95%, and it's only 5% that's biochemical. Now, those are the measurable, those are kind of the known. When we are looking at things like the biofield from a historical perspective and looking at other cultures, they tend to talk about this as a form of energy, and things from the Japanese tradition that they call ki, or in the Chinese tradition, qi, or prana, of course, coming from the Indian-based traditions. Now, biophotons, which is one aspect of the biofield, are literally low, ultra weak photon emissions that are coming off the body. And this is not conjecture, this is measurable. It's not easy to measure them because they're so low in their frequency, but you can measure photon emissions that are coming off the body, and you can measure them in vitro and looking at cell-to-cell communication, as well as literally measuring them from a human being. And they tend to be, again, of this very low frequency from an EEG perspective in the low alpha range. So all organisms actually emit these biophotons, or photons, and bio because they're coming from a biological being. And a lot of this can be measured from these types of experiments that you would do in vitro. And interestingly, there is a diurnal rhythm that has also been documented as it relates to photon emissions, following this relatively fixed pattern of increasing from morning till afternoon, and then starting to decrease again across the course of the day. And so the question, is this a way of, is it a tool that we could use to actually diagnose different abnormalities in the body? And of course, many of you know from Ayurvedic medicine, Chinese medicine, traditional Japanese and Korean medicine, the measurement of energy, whether that's detected through taking the pulse or looking at the tongue as a way of determining imbalances in the body, is something that is part of these cultures. Now, interestingly, from a device perspective, the use, of course, of energy medicine dates back to, in some sense, Madame Curie's discovery, and then the ability to take photons, in this case, high energy photons, and transmit them into another human being to treat cancer, which we call radiation therapy. It is photons. And of course, now we're using protons and other forms of energy to treat cancer. But there's also the use of pulsed electromagnetic therapy, transcranial magnetic stimulation, low-level laser therapy. These are all forms of what we could call energy medicine that have been turned into devices. And something more recently discovered is actually the use of low-frequency electromagnetic fields, which is what the body emits, in the treatment of cancer, as you see pictured there, above the name of the company called NovoCure, which is a FDA-approved device of low-frequency electromagnetic fields for the treatment of recurrent GBM. So when we're talking about biofields, of course, we're thinking of initially these internal practices that we can reduce to, biobehavioral, and this is the way we've typically examined them, things like yoga, tai chi, qigong, looking at sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system balance and preferentially increasing parasympathetic tone, etc., as a form of relaxation, calming the body, etc. But there's also what would be called the more external forms of biofield therapy, where this is, of course, a separate biofield therapist. I'm going to avoid using the word healer because the word healer comes relatively loaded term, and it suggests outcome versus something like a biofield therapist. So these are practices from different cultures where appropriate training of an individual to be able to be connected to themselves and then emitting energy and very importantly healing intent from themselves into another person, and typically done within the vicinity of the person. You don't necessarily need to touch the person. And of course, once you start describing this research to people, they kind of roll their eyes and wonder what you're doing, and are you serious? And then I'm not going to talk about the distance stuff. I'm sure people on this session have had their own personal experience of distant biofield therapy, if not actual practitioners of being a distant biofield therapist. But we're going to talk about the ones where the person is actually in the room with you, although not necessarily touching you as they do with massage. So let's do a little detour here, because when we talk about something like the biofield therapies, Reiki, Qigong, as Lee mentioned, I'm one of the founders of this organization. We were very careful to distance ourselves from anything biofield, energy medicine. And as you all know, the National Center for Integrative Medicine and Health at the NIH has very much distanced themselves from anything to do with energy medicine. In fact, I think, it may be a footnote under the definition of what complementary and alternative medicine is, and they try and avoid it, even though they did actually originally fund center grants. And I'll share with you some of the data that evolved from some of those original funding initiatives. But they received so much pressure to not fund this area, and they received so much ridicule for putting any money into this area, that they essentially backed off. And instead of stepping in, as we have done at MD Anderson, to make the argument that we need to research it and understand it, and if there's nothing there, then we need to know that too. And if there is something there, then we need to understand it and research it. And I think one of the reasons why there's so much skepticism behind it, and we could throw in homeopathy here as a form of energy medicine as well, is because both things like homeopathy, and in particular me waving my hands over something thinking that we'd get any kind of reaction, defies essentially what we think of the laws of physics as we know them today. As a footnote, if you were to talk to quantum physicists and people involved with, who really truly understand concepts of entanglement from the theoretical perspective, they have no problems with what I'm talking about. But I'm guessing we don't have any card-carrying quantum physicists or entanglement scientists on the line. And if we do, it'd be great to hear from them at the end to be able to talk about some of the mechanisms. But interestingly, they don't have a problem with this, that you do something to some molecule on this part of the world and it will have an impact on a molecule on a different part of the world in a different laboratory, because at one point they were connected. So they understand it, but we don't understand it. We definitely don't understand it within the very reductionistic biomedicine world that we all live and work in. So when we talk about the history of science, however, you know, these concepts of questioning things that we don't quite understand, of course, has a deep history. And here we see Galileo and Darwin, Pasteur. More recently, I'm not sure, hopefully some of you on the call remember the remarkable lecture given by Judah Folkman, who is the person who discovered angiogenesis. And he put up on one of his slides essentially because back then there wasn't, you know, cutting and pasting and screenshots, essentially a photograph of the grant review from the NIH that said that there's only one person in the world who would believe and try to do research on such a crazy concept as angiogenesis, and that is the principal investigator of this application. He never received NIH funding for his work in angiogenesis, and some would argue that if he hadn't have died, he probably would have won the Nobel Prize and was certainly on the short list year after year, which in and of itself is remarkable. And of course, there's at least 5 different drugs that have been developed for the treatment of diseases in and around angiogenesis. It hasn't seen, you know, the full potential in cancer treatment. However, it is continually being researched. And, you know, close to our heart in the area of mind-body medicine is Bob Ader, who really helped to overturn the concept that the immune system was an autonomous system in the body, which was really a pivotal point and the birth of the whole field of psychoneuroimmunology, that thoughts and feelings will actually influence your biology, and in some sense, putting to rest the Cartesian dualism that has pervaded medicine for far too long. Now, I don't know if folks know about Semmelweis. Semmelweis I see in particular today as an extremely interesting story, in that he did what he was supposed to do in terms of research, and went from observation to experimentation. And I'll show you some of the data. I'm trying to get you guys in the right position to not. So he was a physician in in Hungary and was one of the early pioneers in antiseptic procedures. And his primary observation was um, in complications post delivery. And he was looking at the percentage of patients who had mortality and you know, these complications after the procedures. And he noticed there was a big difference between the babies that were delivered in here, what you see pictured as the first clinic versus the second clinic. And he looked at all the different reasons for that. And the only thing that he was able to determine was that in the first clinic, which was primarily being overseen by physicians, a lot of the physicians were coming from doing autopsies in the morgue, where they spent a lot of their time, and then they delivered the babies. And in the second clinic, it was primarily supported by midwives. And the midwives, because women are smarter than men, and back then it was mainly men who were the physicians, probably exclusively men, they washed their hands before they delivered babies, and they kind of just knew intuitively that that's probably a good idea. So he set it up as a more formal clinical trials. And, you know, this is just a, you know, a snapshot of some of the observational data. And there was and he experimented with all different ways of washing hands. And he clearly definitively showed, in as best as was done back in the 1800s of clinical trials of comparisons, that if you clean your hands in some fashion before you delivered a baby, the chance of having fever and mortality of mother-child just plummeted. The evidence was incontrovertible, but he was ridiculed by society. Supposedly, he was very bombastic and not an easy person to get along with. So he probably didn't deliver his message in the kindest, most gentle way. Probably had this massive ego, but he was essentially dismissed by society. And part of the reason is there was no biological explanation for why washing your hands was relevant. Today we think, are you kidding? You know, this is what everyone's doing more than ever, is washing their hands, because we know about germ theory, we know about microbes, we know about microorganisms. This was pre all of that. So there was no understandable mechanism. So it was all summarily dismissed. I'm not going to go into details about Kuhn and structure of scientific revolution, but there was, you know, Kuhn's concept is that there is that scientific progress has these massive shifts. And so that, you know, at that point when germ theory was discovered, there was this overturning of all these preconceived notions. When, you know, Bob Bader made his discovery, at least in the small world that we live in, of psychology, it, you know, it just changes everything once we know that, you know, thoughts and emotions can influence biology. But there's been challenges to that, and the slow progress that we see happening every day within quote unquote normal science doesn't have to be these massive shifts. Are going to be important as well. I think, however, that when we are talking about energy medicine, that when we discover, you know, and are able to document concepts at a medical level, the relevance of entanglement, that may seem like a massive paradigm shift. So I'm going to take you through some of the research in this whole area of energy medicine, and start with the area of therapeutic touch. You know, they're called different things, but, you know, therapeutic touch, healing touch, Reiki, external Qigong. But at the end of the day, they're all, although from different origins and training programs, the concepts are very much the same. which is really focusing on that last bullet there, which is, trying to emit energy for the purposes of the greater good of that person. Now, just as a side note, when, in speaking to healing touch and other biofield therapy practitioners, in some situations, the greatest good for the individual, when we're talking clinically, may be a painless, speedy death. And it's been very clear in speaking with individuals that it is not just about ridding somebody of disease, but ridding somebody of suffering. And if cure is the potential, then of course, cure and disease regression is what's going to happen. And so most of the research to date has not been done in patients with advanced disease, in patients who have curable disease, and in fact is primarily focused on aspects of quality of life. However, before getting into the clinical, where there's all these complications of placebo effect and all the rest of it, there's a lot of work and mechanistic-based work that can be done and a better understanding of the whole field when you look at cell culture. Cells are, separate from the body. Theoretically, they don't understand concepts like placebo, and we're not going to go there. And some may argue that they do, and they are sentient beings, but assuming that the cell is just this isolated thing that's sitting in a petri dish. Gloria Kronowitz, whose work is represented on this slide, has done a lot of research in this area, and in fact funded by NCCIH, what was NCAM back then, on what they called Frontier Medicine Center grants. And she clearly showed, and I'll show you some of her later data. This is earlier work that you can see was published over 10 years ago, that the therapeutic touch had an effect on osteoblasts and had an impact not just on the growth of these cells, but actually on some of the key biological processes. And she's, a card-carrying, basic scientist, and essentially brought therapeutic touch into her laboratory and studying it in the same way that she was studying all the other types of drugs that she was exploring. More recently, she did some in vivo studies with mouse breast cancer models, as you can see pictured on this slide, just published a few years ago. And so in this example of just decreasing number of metastatic colonies, you see here the therapeutic touch group, which on average had lower number of metastatic colonies compared to the cancer animals, and she also importantly had a control group. She looked at biological function, in this case looking at different cytokines and chemokines, and we see here essentially a decrease in some of these inflammatory markers when you compare the animals with cancer who had therapeutic touch versus the control group. And she also saw, looking at the tumor microenvironment, a difference in this case, in the spleen of macrophage infiltration with lower amounts of macrophages. And macrophages in the tumor microenvironment actually help to increase tumor growth. And similarly, a decrease in Treg cells and an increase in non-Treg lymphocytes, again, reflecting better immunocompetence and better ability to actually control tumor growth. This laboratory out of Harvard has done a number of studies looking at this form of external Qigong, and again, back into in vitro models and showing decreases in a number of key biological processes that are associated with proliferation of, in this case, it's prostate cancer cells. Now, when it comes to clinical trials, and we've published some review papers in this area, the biggest issues are the methodological quality. You know, first and foremost are issues around blinding and having appropriate control groups. In the non-cancer world, in fact, in pain research, there's been some interesting research where the biofield therapist is behind a curtain or a control person, so that the patient receiving the treatment didn't know, what group they were in, and finding some benefits in terms of pain control. But specifically in cancer populations, there hasn't been as rigorous a experimental design. That second bullet's related to that pain. And in some of the other areas, there's more moderate evidence or mixed evidence for symptom control. However, we all know and accept the fact that there's a massive placebo effect for anything that we do to help with symptom control. But there is something specific going on, and we see that here, as we do with acupuncture and other interventions, that there is a percentage of the variance that is accounted for by something specifically related to biofield therapy. Susan, who some of you know, Lukendorf University of Iowa, did a fascinating study in looking at, in this case, it was healing touch in cervical cancer patients who are undergoing chemoradiation. And as you can see in the title of the article, she doesn't use the word biofield, she doesn't use the word energy medicine, she calls it a novel integrative approach. And I'm sure there was lots of arguments with the editors of BBI on how to position this. So in this study, she actually had a relaxation group. You can see there in the middle of 20 patients, and then usual care and the healing touch group. So NK cell function, she actually sees preservation of natural killer cell function, which goes beyond just a subjective report. It's actually looking in vitro at how well that particular aspect of immune function, critically important for controlling cancer, is compared to the relaxation and usual care. And we see differences there clearly at the 6-week time point, the end of radiotherapy, and probably due to the variance, it's not quite there in the middle, but we can see the clear direction it's going. Similarly, for depressive symptoms being the lowest in the healing touch group as well. So this is Chamonix's work. I've just picked two clinical trials that were of the highest quality. And interestingly, here you can see what the title of her article is. You have no idea what it's about. It doesn't say energy medicine. It doesn't say therapeutic touch. I think in her case, it was therapeutic touch-based intervention for breast cancer patients who are experiencing cancer-related fatigue. So she had the what she called the healing group. She did a mock healing group, so a real control group there, and then weightless controls. And we can see here in terms of fatigue, clear benefit for the intervention group. The mock group, not surprisingly, did benefit as well. And we would be surprised if there wasn't a benefit in the mock group, because we all know the robustness of a placebo. In this case, probably the use of the term placebo is not appropriate. It has to do with presence. It has to do with connection with another human being. But something different was, of course, going on here in the true healing group. Similarly, on a biological outcome that you see pictured here, which is cortisol rhythmicity, starts high in the morning, drops throughout the course of the day. Steepness of slope has been repeatedly, including in our laboratory in kidney cancer patients and in other laboratories for other cancer populations. The steepness of the slope not only reflects better cortisol regulation, but has also been a predictor of survival in multiple cancer models. And we see here the steepest slope is in the individuals who were receiving the actual healing versus the other two control groups. Very similar pattern actually to what we see in breast cancer patients after undergoing 12 sessions of yoga. So our first adventure in this area of biofield therapy was actually working with Master He, who I was introduced to by Dr. Chen, who was working at that time. He was at he was in New Jersey and subsequently moved to work with Brian Berman at the University of Maryland. And he'd had a couple of R21s funded by NCCIH to look at external Qigong for osteoarthritis of the knee. And this Qigong master claimed that he could shrink breast cancer tumors, in particular when they were very small and at an early stage, and had multiple documentations of this phenomena. So, you know, being crazy, I said, okay, we can test that. And I went to at that point, Dr. Maury Markman, who was the vice president for clinical research, and we had co-written a book, some of you may know, on integrative medicine, so co-edited. So, you know, I already knew that he was positively inclined and open to this. And he's like, yeah, it's totally crazy, but we can research it. We can do ultrasounds before and after. We can do MRIs before and after. And, you know, let's just put all the safety measures in place. As a side note, you know, when we, all of you know, when to do our research, we need, of course, IRB approval. Before IRB approval, you need scientific approval. And when this protocol was presented, we go and we give, you know, a 5-minute overview of the study and answer any questions. And typically 5 or 10 minutes later, we leave the room and they make their determination. I was in the room answering questions for this study for 90 minutes. I mean, it was endless. It went on and on. Somebody had actually gone to Master He's website, and there was something about that he could raise people from the dead. And, you know, at that point, I threw my hands up in the air, and it's just like, we're not claiming that. We just want to do this one little experiment. And, you know, at the end of the day, you either let us or you don't. Prior to actually doing this work, I was working with Susan Lukendorf to try and get increased recruitment for her therapeutic touch study that I just presented to you, because she was lagging in recruitment. Brought it to MD Anderson, NIH grant, already ongoing. Our IRB disproved the study. The first time in my, now I've been there over 22 years, have never had a study disproved. And one of the reasons was that if it got out that MD Anderson was doing this kind of research, the media would have a field day, we'd be ridiculed. And so we weren't able to do that study, but we were able to do this study, which is even crazier, because here we're proposing to shrink tumors, not just make patients feel better. Long story short, it didn't work. And this is, you know, the actual data, extremely small study of patients, both in China as well as in MD Anderson. Ultrasounds are very subjective in nature, it turns out. And so we ended up also doing the study in China where we did MRIs, which are not subjective in nature or can be manipulated. And there's less cultural barriers. There was no language issues. Whole other story of how I was able to do this in China, which was quite interesting. But it was a negative study. We published it, and these are the Chinese women, and then we carried on. And where we carried on is about 10 years ago, being introduced to Sean Harribance, who you see pictured here. The laboratory up in Laurentian University in Canada, led by the now deceased Michael Persinger, had been working with Mr. Harribance for a number of years. And Sean is known as a clairvoyant, or, you know, a more known term, a psychic. And, you know, a lot of you are probably rolling your eyes as saying that. I am perhaps more skeptical than anyone about that type of concept, being able to predict a future, or not knowing somebody knows something about their past. And I'll share one anecdote, and I know anecdote isn't data, around my experience with Sean Harribance. This was about just over 2 years ago now, and we'd already done a number of studies with Sean, both in vitro and in vivo, that I'll share the data with you. And I hadn't seen Sean in person for about 1.5 years, or actually spoken to him on the phone. Most of our interesting form of communication is I will send him emails, and because he doesn't find it easy to type or to write, he'll leave long voicemail messages for me. So for that, you know, prior 1.5 years, it'd been primarily in that way. He hadn't seen me, and he hadn't heard my voice. On a Saturday in March, I sent him an email saying, you know, asking him some questions about my future and some decision-making processes. And he said, I'm happy to talk to you, but you have to call me. So on that Saturday, I called him. And of course, I'll always remember this conversation, sitting on a hotel room in Chicago, because I was giving a lecture earlier that weekend. And he said, I'm happy to get to your questions, but I need to tell you that there's something wrong with you. You are sick, and you must go see a doctor as soon as you can. And I'm kind of, yeah, okay, Sean, that's fine. And he said, you're going to be fine, but you need to see a doctor right away. Oh, and by the way, you must start exercising and managing your stress immediately. It wasn't like, you know, tomorrow or when you find time. He was like, immediately. So unbeknownst to Sean, for the prior 2 weeks, I had a growing lymph node under my left armpit. And the phrase that he used about my illness was that you have a blockage somewhere in your body. So that was on a Saturday. Wednesday, I had a very close breast cancer surgeon palpate this node under my left axilla. And she said, let's try and get that biopsy today. So it was already 4 o'clock, so we didn't get a biopsy that day, but we did get a biopsy the next day. And it came back as malignant cells that within 5 days or so, they determined was melanoma. This is just one example of literally hundreds of Sean's, in particular, unique ability of being able to diagnose somebody's illness. And again, you know, he knows me, but he literally hadn't seen me or heard my voice for 1.5 years, and he was able to determine this. He tends to look at photographs of people and very, very eerily saying to somebody, you know, that if you don't go and see a doctor, you're not going to make it through the weekend. People roll their eyes. Some listen to him, they go to the doctor and they find out they're 95% occluded. And again, he sees this just from looking at a photograph. So back to the research. So Michael Persinger has been researching Sean for quite some time and looking at, in particular, what happens, what changes in his brain during these clairvoyant states, and was actually able to digitize that change in electromagnetic pattern and then play it back. In this case was to cells, and clearly having an effect, interestingly, on this these melanoma cells in vitro, showing an impact on cell growth. And he's done this and replicated this with different patterns over time. Because of time, I'm not going to get into too much of this data, but I'll shift to our data. But they went in and they looked at different patterns, different cell lines, as you can see there, showing a clear impact. And in particular, when they shift to animal models, a decrease in these melanoma cell line in terms of cell growth. Again, just being exposed to the EMF. We're not talking about Sean here, but a digitized version of Sean's EEG, or in this case, it's actually a related EEG. And including increase here, you can see in proliferation markers for apoptosis, and a decrease in proliferation marker here, the Ki-67. So we've now done multiple in vitro studies with Sean, 4 specific animal studies. And importantly, because, I'm, again, you may not believe it, but, I'm so skeptical about this whole area. Until Sean diagnosed my cancer indirectly, I was really skeptical about any of the concepts of clairvoyance. It's, because we tend to focus when they're right, but we don't focus when they're wrong. And some data suggests that if you take all the positives and the negatives, it ends up being chance. Saying you have blockage in your body when I had a growing node is kind of not chance, because my wife was the only person in the world who knew I had a growing node under my arm. So be that as it may, being so untrustworthy, I was the control person. And so I watched everything Sean did, repeated his movements exactly. I was actually probably not far enough away from him, but if anything, that would just diminish the potential effect of what we found. We wanted to control for heat, for attention, for biophoton from a human being, and importantly in the cell work, for cells being on the counter and out of the incubator for the time of exposure. So here you see some of our early study when we're looking at just cell viability in vitro, and a clear decrease in both at a half an hour, which is essentially right after the session, as well as 3 hours later, both in the human lung cancer cell line as well as the animal cell line, which of course we needed to do because of the animal work. We wanted to work with animals that had intact immune systems. You don't need a lot of statistics here to clearly show a decrease in cell growth between the control and the experimental. And similar to the other work out of Harvard that I presented, some key biological processes being influenced by this form of biofield treatment. So here's 2 separate animal studies, and importantly, these were started when the tumors were extremely small. When we did a third animal experiment when the tumors were 80 to 100 millimeter in diameter before we started the treatment, we actually didn't have any effects. So some suggestion that, when the cancer is kind of out of the station, it's harder, at least in this cancer model, is extremely aggressive. I mean, let's not forget, we're talking about lung cancer here, that it was harder to control. But clear difference, we replicated it in 2 separate studies. If you look at tumor weight, tumor volume, clear differences here between experimental and control group. Looking at multiple different biological processes, some in the right direction, the only one reaching here marginal statistical significance, which some may criticize us for, but we're just sharing the data. And actually, surprisingly, Pei Ying, who's the leader of all this research in her laboratory, Dr. Yang, said that most preclinical scientists don't even present work that's negative. So there's other data in the paper that was, actually negative. But here we see, modest differences in this phosphorylated S6, which is a marker of the mTOR pathway and relevant to proliferation. Interestingly, and for my melanoma treatment, I received an anti-PD-L1, an immunotherapy agent, and the experimental treatment was actually able to downregulate PD-L1 expression in the tumor microenvironment, as well as, statistically significantly here, MCP1, which is a chemokine related to inflammation. And we see modest effect for some of these other cytokines, but they didn't reach statistical significance. Somewhat regular, modification here in the immune system, similar to Gloria's work in terms of a reduction in Tregs and a reduction in macrophages in the tumor microenvironment, which is, of course, something that you want to see. This was our 4th study that's in press now at ICT. And interestingly, we didn't see a lot of difference in tumor size in this replication. So some would say, that you weren't able to replicate. But what we didn't look at in the first studies was necrosis. And so when we went and looked at the cells, we actually see at the cancers after autopsy, and the pathologist who did all this was blind to group, is that there was clear increase in necrosis. So the tumors weren't any smaller, but they were essentially dying and had a high amount of necrosis, in particular for these 6 animals. And these 4 animals didn't look that different from the controls and had very little necrosis. 3 of these 4 were on the right-hand side, and we'll come back to that when I show you a picture. Very excitingly, we saw a difference in stem cell markers. So being able to impact the primary cancer is one thing, but you all know that chemotherapy and other therapies work very well for the primary cells, but not so good at killing cancer stem cells. And that's a predictor of recurrence of disease, is if you have the cancer stem cells surviving your treatment. So here's the behavior, and this was, just an example of one of the first experiments. These are the control animals, regular mice. They're very happy. They're exploring. As you can see, they're set up in 2 different chambers, 5 on one side, 5 in the other, but all part of that first experiment. And these are Sean's animals. And we have, I'll show you some data. We subsequently actually, analyzed it more systematically with cameras behind. My kids, being well-trained skeptics like I am, looked at this when I first had this data, so to speak, and they said, well, but, in the one, the head's against and your head's not against, it's not a good experiment. Totally correct. This was just, me filming when I was in the room. But even so, this is just overwhelming. So what's interesting, if you look at, I could show you the right chamber as well, and there was significantly decreased movement in the right chamber, and I'll show you the data in a second. But what's interesting is that, and this was replicated in all the experiments, in the left chamber, not only were the animals clumped, but they were clumped up front and didn't move very much. On the right-hand side, they were further back, didn't move necessarily more than on the left-hand side of the experimental, but they weren't as close. And what Persinger was able to publish and document is a particular electromagnetic frequency and photon emissions from the right prefrontal cortex, which would be correlating with the left side. And if we go back to that necrosis data, the 3 animals that had 0 necrosis were on the right, and all the animals on the left-hand side, in this case there was 5, had high levels of necrosis. So we did set up GoPro cameras at the back. We only recorded for the first 2 sessions because Sean started to get concerned with the electromagnetic activity that could be coming off the GoPro. And but you know, again, you don't need a lot of fancy statistics to clearly show that there are differences here. So all the animals tend to have less movement as we go across time. The first 30 minutes, the second 30 minutes, but still a 2-fold difference between the experimentals and controls. And we had problems with the cameras, and so we are moving on in this area of research. And I've just gone through an interesting experience that I can share with people personally offline about getting our next stage of this research funded. We have now received substantial funding to be able to bring in multiple healers, to look at multiple cancer models, to measure what's going on, both from the perspective of the biofield therapist, as well as, importantly, manipulating the environment. So, you know, the easiest way to manipulate EMFs is to put the target, so to speak, the petri dish or the animals, in a Faraday box that's been enhanced to block both electrical and magnetic fields. And if the effect disappears, first, if we, you know, rigorously, you know, redocument the effect is there, and then if we can have it disappear, we know it has something to do with EMF. Many people believe that it has nothing to do with EMF, because if it was EMF and a direct contact, then how do you explain the distance healing stuff? So again, I remain a little skeptical that there's great data to prove distant healing, but the other theories out there is that this has more to do with entanglement. But the key is to be able to do more of this, and you know, hanging out there in particular for the interests of venture capitalists is, if we can understand the mechanisms, then we can develop devices. And again, history would show that we are very innovative creatures, and we can take a phenomena that we learn about and create a device. You're probably all familiar with the dogs that can be trained to smell cancer from urine. You know, that's very good and interesting, but what's happening now is, of course, they're building machines that are replicating what happens inside a dog's olfactory tract to be able to determine these molecules. So with that, I will thank, in particular, Dr. Yang and Sean Harribance and the others in the group, the small amount of funding that Ed Bossarge and Marie Bossarge and Black Bear Life Sciences provided for this, and close with the father of psychology and his wise words when he said, when a thing is new, people will say it's not true. You know, of course, biofield therapy, that's where we are today. Later, when the truth becomes obvious, they'll say it's not important. And then finally, when its importance can't be denied, they'll say, well, you know, anyway, it's not new. That's where we are with hand washing. I hope everyone out there stays healthy, follows the great advice of Semmelweis, ignores Semmelweis's peers. And with that, I'll stop, and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Cohen. That was provocative, and that was so interesting about the stem cells and the necrosis and the PDL1. I see one. I'm going to open up for questions now. I see one in the chat box already. Dr. Cohen, did you experience one of these biofield therapy modalities during your cancer journey?
I did actually. I'm not leaving anything up to chance. And certainly when it comes to biofield, there's the only harm is time and money. And reached out to the Houston community to find out who would be the ideal person to bring into the house. And I was actually worked on by two spectacular women, one who was a former nurse, and they did this combination, a former nurse at MD Anderson, this combination of healing touch and Reiki, and they worked in concert with each other. It was spectacular. And I don't know whether it was I don't know what it was that was going on in that room, but at one point, the women were working up top, and they were clearly on either side of my body. And I felt something pulling on my ankles. And I kind of freaked out at first, and then thought, well, maybe, is it just, in my head? And I thought, should I look up? Should I, pull myself out of, this very relaxed state? And then I kind of just said, I'll just go with it. Still remain kind of freaked out, but then it started to feel good. And when I shared that with them afterwards, and they said it's actually not an uncommon experience, and it's, they're not able to, of course, explain it from a biological perspective. But yeah, if people haven't experienced any kind of biofield therapy, it's worth trying.
We have another question about the use of vibrational therapy, for instance, tuning forks to affect the biofield.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with that work. I do know that that people do that, and for those who don't know, there's these large tuning forks that are hit and then can be placed on different parts of the bodies. Typically, they'll place them on different chakra points. I've played around with that just when our music therapist, got some tuning forks, and we kind of all had fun with it. But I haven't looked into that research at all.
Thank you. Another question. Just curious, why and from whom did the NIH get pressure not to research biofield therapies?
Well, I can guarantee you from our arch nemesis over at the Science-Based Medicine Group, David Gorski, and others may remember, all of their nefarious names. They're theoretically good people, but aren't open-minded to what the data is actually showing. And I think that we're going to experience that with biofield therapy, as we did with acupuncture, which is a lot of the pressure came literally from within the NIH as well, other centers and other leaders. And it continues today. So forget about biofield. They do not want NCCIH to exist, and think it's a waste of taxpayer dollars to research things like yoga, meditation, acupuncture. They continually, they is a big term, of course, but even in the face of the evidence from MRIs and the wonderful work of Helen Langevin, who's actually heads NCCIH, showing the fascia, wrapping around acupuncture needles and a better understanding of the mechanisms, they still dismiss it. I think this goes back again to, the history of medicine, and regardless of the amount of evidence, we're going to have to wall ourselves up in the outskirts of Florence, like Galileo had to do, and history will be on our side. Now, from the acupuncture perspective, of course, organizations like ASCO, like NCCN, the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, they have acupuncture on the guidelines. So, they don't really care about the skeptics, they care about the data. And hopefully Biofield Therapies will fall into that category even prior to the mechanisms, but hopefully the mechanisms will kind of put it to rest if there's something there.
We've got time for probably about one more, maybe two questions, and I'm just going to read a comment that someone wrote. Dear doctor, I am an acupuncturist practitioner with a hospital affiliation. I have made the observations with a biofield camera in my office and how the field changes or reorganized before and after the acupuncture. I continue to note these changes and make sense out of the process. I am interested in sharing my observations with those also making these notes.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think part of the challenge in the measurement of this is the quality of the equipment. So it's probably a GVD type device, and there's evidence to suggest exactly what you're reporting, which is that you can quantifiably measure a change in the biofield of the receiver as well as the transmitter from before to after. And the key is doing more systematic research. And we're kind of in this catch-22 that hopefully our lab as well as others can start to get out of, which is until there's meaningful funding put into it, you're not going to be able to do high quality research, and the research will constantly be criticized. So, the NIH took a stab at overcoming that by funding the area. And in fact, a lot of the research was positive, and then they got cold feet and backed out. So hopefully that will start to change. And depending on what happens in November, there could be a lot more support for not only cancer, but in particular, some of these more frontier areas.
Important point, yeah. Okay, questions keep coming. I'm just gonna, this will be our last one. How about that? Could you please say more about the role of entanglement?
Well, maybe somebody else can jump in too if they're comfortable in the area of physics. I haven't gone that deep into the area of physics. We are bringing on a physicist as a consultant into our group, somebody who worked with, I'm not sure if people are familiar with the DOD and the CIA back in the 70s, funding something that they called Stargate, which was following the lead of the Russians of enlisting clairvoyants to do remote viewing. So to be able to be, at the Pentagon and being able to see where the missiles are hidden. So this physicist is going to be advising us. And, the concept of entanglement is, from my very early understanding, is that, of course, everything is connected. And there's evidence from, in particular, at the quantum physics level, so these very small dimensions, that once two molecules have been in the presence of each other, if you separate them and you do something to one of them, the other one is going to change. And so that they're entangled. When in time that happens, I'm not sure. Some would argue that entanglement is there all the time, everywhere, and we're just not sensitive enough, and with the appropriate training, that you can be. And there is that concept, how does if it's true, and it's hard for me to say it's not true now, the concept of knowing something that hasn't happened yet, or knowing something that you should know about that's happened in the past, has to do with information transfer. And entanglement is about information transfer that happens simultaneously. It's happening all the time. And of course, Einstein talked about the space-time continuum, and it's not linear. And so these clairvoyants, in theory, are not seeing something that hasn't happened that's in the future because we think the future hasn't happened. It's actually happened, and they're able to somehow access that information or see it in some fashion. So, you know, I think we have to rely on our physics colleagues to be able to untangle that, so to speak. But, you know, it's interesting if you and now all the information about Stargate came out just a couple of years ago because it was declassified. And they, you know, if you go to Wikipedia, which interestingly you know, I think everyone on the SIO is going to be getting this email about Wikipedia and the nefarious background on Wikipedia, and how Wikipedia has been infiltrated and controlled by people who are anti-integrative medicine. And you don't have to go far to know that by just looking at how they describe acupuncture, and they attack a lot of us on Wikipedia, and then you get into these editing wars. Anyway, you go to Wikipedia about Stargate, and they say nothing meaningful came of it. Now, the DoD funded Stargate in the multi-million dollars for over 20 years. If nothing meaningful was coming of it after 5 years, 10 years, even 15 years, every year they had to go to Congress and present their case for why they would get millions of dollars to keep this program going. You know, very, very skeptical that nothing ever came of it. Supposedly they found downed jets that were, you know, American jets that have been shot down, and you know, the stories go on. There's some documentaries about it. So I'll close with that, and wish you all a wonderful Labor Day weekend for those who are in our country, and a wonderful weekend for those who are not in our country. For those who are not in our country, you're probably in a country that is much more balanced and sane about what's going on. I'm beaming to you from the countryside outside of Toronto in Canada. I'm happy to be working and living here. I love America, but it's not a healthy place right now. And I hope we get healthy. And thank you all for joining. I'll pass it back to Lee.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cohen. I'm just looking at the chat box, and there's so much gratitude. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Best wishes with your health. Great series. So many accolades. And I thank you so much for closing our final Wellness Wednesday with such a provocative and thoughtful conversation, looking at the intersection of consciousness and quantum physics and the healing energies. I also want to thank everyone who's on the call today and who has joined us every Wednesday for the last 14 weeks. Quite unbelievable that we have produced more than 12 hours of programming on wellness and mind-body techniques. So thank you all so much, and go in peace and wellness. Thank you so much.